Sometimes you're just looking for that read, that book that will fill up your reading tummy, that when you're finished, you're going to sit there with that totally satisfied, totally satiated feel. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying.
I have these books that have just left me 4-star satisfied.
Are you satisfied?
I'm very satisfied.
And I wanted to share them with you today. So let's get into them. All right, you guys, so the first book on this list is going to be Permutation City by Greg Egan. This is a book that I have really been looking forward to and I'm slightly a little intimidated by. This book is, I'm going to call it like 1 part Severance, the TV show, with a little mix-in of Tron and 1 part Peter Watt's Blind Side. I know that sounds like a really weird mix, and it was, but it was really an interesting read. We follow Paul, an insurance salesman to billionaires who is trying to use his connections to sell them something else. He also has this very interesting side project where he is trying to digitally create a copy of his conscience who doesn't want to immediately kill itself. Because apparently there's something about the process of creating a digital copy and knowing you're not the original that makes you want to die.
You are not you. You're me. No shit.
In the meantime, we also see that Paul is hiring Maria. She is a genius bioprogrammer in a digital world, can put cells and DNA together to create a really interesting, almost intelligent biological process. And he wants her to create from scratch an entirely new universe with different laws of physics and biology that will start evolving on its own. Now, Maria is a little bit down on her luck, and she's not very good with money. So when Paul asks her to do this impossible task, she's just desperate enough to do it.
I'll do anything.
Until a police officer shows up at her house and says that maybe Paul's intentions aren't what she thought. And yet, she's not sure she cares. This is just the beginning of this very complicated story. The book promises themes like exploring the identity of yourself, ethics of an AI-created being, as well as the best explanation of a multiverse I have ever seen.
It is the best.
And an ending that debates the reality of God. I mean, it's just kind of all over the place, and it's glorious. If you want a really intellectual, philosophical, and yet satisfying read, you gotta pick up Permutation City. The next one on this list is a little bit less philosophical, and that is the 6 World series, of which only 2 books are out, by Rebecca Roanhorse. Now, I know that Rebecca Roanhorse is very celebrated right now for her other series, but for some reason, I picked this up right around Christmas and New Year's. And the first book is Trail of Lightning, followed very closely by Storm of Locusts. These books are super fantastic. If you really like the Dresden Files, or you are a big fan of Winona, the TV show, these books are fun and fast-paced. This is a Native American urban fantasy series. Yeah, I know, crazy, right? But it works. It so works. In it, we follow Maggie, a monster killer, and a social outcast in a post-apocalyptic world where each tribe has its own power. And Maggie has 2 magical powers. She's getting pulled into the case of a missing girl, which she suspects monsters, of course. And it turns out to be worse than she thought it was, as they all are. She's recruiting help from several of the medicine men that she knows and ends up saddled with a partner that she doesn't really want. Together, they have to get into this epic battle for humanity and all the future of everyone. There are so many areas here where they weave in the mythology of Navajo with quite a few magical powers and this case. And there's quite a few tragedies along the way that she has to get herself through. There is a very minor love story that is not what you think, and quite a few gods that make their appearance. I loved the series. It was just such a fun, fantasy, palate cleansing ride. It just really satisfied that itch for me. And I think it's a really underrated series, especially because I don't hear that many people talk about it. Everybody seems really focused on her other series. So Rebecca, if you're out there, I'm waiting for the next book. So if you could get on that, that'd be great, right?
Do it.
All right, next book in the series. To Say Nothing of the Dog by Connie Willis. I know, what a huge change. This is the second book in her Oxford time travel series, but I gotta tell you that I should have listened to so many of you who left me comments on my other videos. This book really doesn't have a whole lot in common with the first book. All you need to know is that she writes several books where in the future Oxford time travel historians go into the past. That's the only connecting piece. Totally different characters, totally different time periods, totally different worlds. And this one in particular is supposed to be very well known for its British sense of humor.
Little British humor.
And it should have come with a warning on the front cover for that. This one follows time-traveling historians through many absurdist scenarios in Victorian-era England. And I guess there is a woman in the future who is obsessed with recreating a very historically insignificant cathedral that burned down. And so she's constantly overusing her power and sending some of these historians back in time to discover and find pieces of this cathedral, to discover tiny little details about what was used to decorate. Was it cloth or linen? What color was it? Where exactly was it placed? And she is essentially overworking this team of historians for a very strange recreation of this cathedral. And of course, our main character is overworked to the point where he may not anymore remember his name. He's experiencing time gaps from too many time jumps. And of course, continues to get into all kinds of historical trouble.
Troublesome.
Now this story, I think, is supposed to be more fun rather than a serious representation of what's happening, especially since at least half of the story I wanted to choke these characters and say, just tell this old lady no.
Not bloody likely.
This isn't funny, I don't like it, like what are you doing? But as I continued through this story, I just really started loving these characters and really associating with their misadventures. And it really kind of grew on me to the end of the book where I was very satisfied. So I know this book isn't necessarily for everyone, and I have to say it wasn't my sense of humor, but I did eventually really grow to love these characters. And I have to say, Connie Willis really writes slice of life like Stephen King. It's so endearing and so interesting that I highly recommend it. If you're interested in slice of life, but maybe more historical fiction stuff, Connie Willis might be for you. The next one is more of a recent release, and that one is Titanium Noir by Nick Harkaway. This one is a really interesting combination of like some of those old black and white noir mysteries with altered carbon and maybe just a touch of future magic. This story takes place in a world where the rich are able to change their genetic makeup to make them a lot more resilient to age and disease, and they are known as Titans. One of the key factors of distinguishing a Titan from anyone else is that they are 7 foot tall or taller, and of course, they no longer age. We follow Cal, who is a detective who specializes in cases involving Titans, because not all of them are great people, and some of them have crimes committed against them. He is called to the scene of a crime where a murder has taken place, and it is actually a well-known Titan who has become quite a recluse. Nobody really knows initially who would want to kill a Titan, but the world's eyes are on this case. As he begins unraveling the mystery, of course, things are never quite what they seem and always more complicated. And he begins to require the help of his ex-fiancée, who is also a Titan herself, Athena. She is the queen of the underworld in this story, and quite a lot happens. While this book did not blow my socks off, it was really just a satisfying science fiction mystery noir story that I really enjoyed. The ending was a little bit too nice and wrapped up, but I really recommend it if you're in the mood for just a fun, satisfying mystery. The next book on our list is going to be Survival by Julie Zerneda.
What did you say?
I'm not exactly sure how to say her name. I'm so sorry. This story was such a fun read. I cannot wait to pick up the rest of the series. Mac is a work-obsessed salmon researcher who is secretly afraid to ever leave Earth. And she is decided to dedicate her life to studying the migratory patterns and the DNA adaptations of salmon. And right in the middle of one of her all-time big experiments, she gets interrupted by an unwelcome visitor who totally ruins her experiment. And as it turns out, it is an alien creature named Brim, who is, for some reason, really interested in her work with salmon. Now, the government, who has been trying to get to be friends with these aliens, is thrilled and essentially blackmailing Mac into putting up with Brim and all of his questions about her research. Of course, Brim is convinced that some of her research can be used to save the galaxy from this threat that she doesn't know anything about. And by accepting his help and answering his questions, she thrusts herself and all of humanity in the middle of an intergalactic war between the aliens that Brim is and an invisible species who are constantly killing their young. And it is through this mystery, she ends up visiting the alien worlds, she ends up finding herself on the wrong side, and really learning a whole lot more about herself and the aliens, and what exactly the aliens are keeping secret. Now, there are so many layers to the story, and there are so many answers, and the book ends with more questions than we have answers. Yet, I think this series is going to be one of my new satiating favorites. I really like the way that the author writes the world, and it's so immersive. The aliens were very interesting, and I really enjoy the twists and turns of the story that were not as predictable as I had expected them to be. So if you're into some hard biology science fiction, this one might be for you. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Sherry Tepper's Grass, but just a little bit more action-oriented. The next story on this list is one I've been meaning to get to for forever, and that is Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. This story is one of those old stories that just feels like it was written more recently. It also inspired the TV show The Last of Us because it has and started a lot of the post-apocalyptic tropes as well as a lot of the zombie tropes, but it doesn't have zombies in it. It's actually man-eating plants, so that's kind of cool.
That's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
This story was not what I expected. Definitely didn't make my 5-star list, and yet it was still satisfying. I think one of the reviewers on Goodreads put it perfectly. It is the perfect slow apocalypse. There's not quite as much action as I was originally hoping for, but it did really establish a lot of those tropes that you will come to recognize. Like our main character being in the hospital, and that's why he made it through the main apocalyptic event. This story starts out very slowly with the distribution of the triffids, which is a man-eating plant that was initially not discovered or even noticed. And it was only when the triffids reach a certain level of maturity that they uproot themselves and they can walk around and move. This is actually seen as somewhat of a novelty. And despite being on the news, a lot of people begin to grow triffids because of how cool it is. Of course, later we discover that the triffids can sting and digest humans, and they are seen as dangerous. So it is companies that grow the triffids specifically because they can then extract oil, which is something that is particularly delicious and in high demand. So of course our economic needs outweigh our logic and survival, as is the theme in a lot of John Wyndham books, or at least all 2 of them that I've read. This story was a lot more slow and a lot more plotting, a lot more about our main character coming to terms with the changes of the world itself. And the post-apocalyptic event doesn't happen until about halfway through, when he lands himself in the hospital thanks to a stray triffid bite. And of course, while he's in the hospital, there is a beautiful meteor shower that everyone watches and tells him how beautiful it is, and it's too bad he can't see. And then of course, everyone wakes up the next day blind, and the majority of the world has then gone blind. It's only those people who did not watch the meteor shower that are now able to see, and it is here that we see how terrible humans can be to each other and what happens to all of the people who are now blinded in a world full of moving, walking plants that can digest and eat us. Again, if you go into this book, understand that this is more a slow apocalypse build up, more of an internal monologue. This book would probably be one that people who loved Station 11 might like, although it does have a little bit of a less positive outlook on humanity. So if you're into post-apocalyptic fiction and you want to know where a lot of those tropes came from, Day of the Triffids might be something for you. Next, we have a little bit more of a recent release, and that is First Sister by Lyndon A. Lewis. This story is a weird mix of Red Rising and like Handmaid's Tale.
I was not expecting that.
Kind of a strange combination, but it really works for me. This is a multi-point of view story. We alternate back and forth, and each of the points of view are on opposite ends of a war between 2 factions of humanity. The first faction, our representative is a female who has been forced into the sisterhood of the goddess, who demands that she give her body to all true believers of the goddess, and therefore she can pray for them. And yes, this is kind of a sexual slavery situation, but don't worry, none of those get graphic. What we can know is that this sister is determined to be the first sister, which is the top of her hierarchy. So that way, she is only available to the captain rather than being available to anyone at large. And she is willing to do anything to stay on top, including betraying herself, betraying her order, and even falling in love. Then we have her alternate perspective, who is a boy soldier that is forcibly separated from his mentally bonded fighting partner, who is also a female. This fighting partner and him were separated because of a failed mission and have been reassigned. He has finally been rehabilitated, and he has reassigned a new partner and a new mission. He has to go out and hunt and kill his former partner. But he's not quite sure he can do it, and he's not quite sure whose side his new partner is on. And of course, as the story progresses, the points of view intermingle and eventually meet. But don't worry, they don't fall in love with each other. I know I hate that kind of trope, and it makes for a more interesting story based off of these 2 individual characters not getting together.
Thank God.
This was a really interesting dystopia, and it doesn't have any aliens in it so far. I plan to pick up the 2nd and the 3rd books in this series because all 3 of them are already out. So I'll let you know how it goes. But in case you're interested, this book was a really interesting first read. Has a lot to say about humanity as a whole and how strong our emotions really can be. This book has a whole lot of action and a whole lot of statements about society. So if you're in for one of those dystopian novels that may not be as predictable as you think, I highly recommend this one. It was really a fun read, and I can't wait to pick up the 2nd and the 3rd, which are already out, by the way. Next on this list is Snow Queen by Joan Vinge. This is one of my 24 books for 2024. This is a very action-packed book that I did not expect. In this book, we have a world that is controlled by 2 different civilizations, the Summer Kingdom and the Winter Kingdom, and they share rule. One of them rules for a certain amount of time and then abdicates the throne, and the other comes in and rules for that same amount of time, and they just share rule of this planet over and over again. And we open our story with a queen who is currently in charge of the planet, and she's breaking her own laws to create a clone of herself. And we don't know exactly why or how this works out. What we do know is that the rest of the story follows Moon, who is a girl who grows up in the Summer Kingdom. Moon is pledged to her best friend and eventually betrothed, but in a last-minute decision, chooses her career over the follow-through of marrying her best friend. And in a plight of guilt, ends up having the two be separated. So her pledged best friend companion ends up going over to the Winter Kingdom and meeting the Snow Queen. There's a lot that happens in this story that is somewhat predictable and then somewhat unexpected. And Moon ends up going to the Summer Kingdom in a plight of regret and trying to find her love and apologize to him. However, a lot of things have happened since, and she ends up getting kidnapped by some mercenaries who take her off planet and reveal to her the truth about her planet that nobody yet knows. In the meantime, the Snow Queen gets more and more desperate to find all of the kids who are revealed as her clones. And yet, we're still not sure why, and the mystery of what happens between these two people at the very end of the book gets more and more mysterious as it goes by. There's a lot of fun twists and turns. Things are a little bit different than you expect, and this world is so immersive and so believable that I'm surprised more people don't talk about this. There is a follow-up, a couple of books to this series, and I'm really looking forward to finding out what happens to Moon next. The next book on this list is going to be Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear. This book came out of nowhere for me, and I was so impressed with it. I go back and forth between giving it 5-star and 4-star, but it is a hard science fiction biology book.
What? Biology.
And that's not something I can say very often. There's so much creativity in this story and so much scientific accuracy that then could become real with creativity. It's just on point for me. This is my kind of story. But here we follow a very clumsy intro into a seemingly unlikable scientist who essentially has too rigid of a views on the world. And he discovers a virus that infects only pregnant women, causing an abortion. And of course, as this spreads across the world, we begin to witness a team of scientists who come together and study it, and then the world goes into COVID mania panic crisis. And yes, this was written before the pandemic, but it does have quite a few parallels there.
Outbreak of zombie.
We also begin to see that as the panic starts to climb, the government starts to come out with information that may or may not be true. Things like this is a disease and pregnant women should stay away from their male partners, and they begin to separate families, and they begin to do experiments that may or may not be ethical. And in the meantime, we start to see the virus progress. And our team of scientists begin to make quite a few breakthroughs, including asking the question, is this a virus or is this actually already embedded in our DNA code? And maybe this is not necessarily a virus, but a forcible way to advance humanity and evolve us very quickly. There is quite a lot of creativity in this story, but I really enjoyed this combination of science and plausibility and creativity that just gave me exactly what I was looking for in a science fiction novel. I loved this book. I thought it was so satisfying, and it was such a good read with just playing with a lot of different ideas about DNA and science and evolution. High recommend for this one. If you have any other recommendations like any of these books, I would really appreciate them in the comment box down below. And that does it for my satisfying recent reads list. But please let me know if you have any other really satisfying reads that you would recommend to me. The comment section is always available, as is my Discord. Until next time, you guys, see you later.